In this lecture, I want to talk about the expulsions and eventual suppression of the society of Jesus, and continuing with the theme of discernment of the noise and the quiet, the noisy ways that the evil spirit can work, and the quiet ways that God can work in us when we are going from good to better, when God is at home within us. It's a troubling time in the history of the society, and I think it is most troubling because although, of course, the Society of Jesus was not without its foibles, and there are plenty of things about the practice of the Society of Jesus on the cusp of the suppression of the society that we can criticize. What's troubling is that it really is not because of those things that we were suppressed. We were suppressed, in fact, for things that were pretty fundamental to who we were, who we are, and we were suppressed because of political forces political situations in which we were caught up by our association with the church, by our association with the papacy. It's an upsetting time. Every time I talk about it, I don't like talking about it. It's a fascinating time, and there are things to be learned and good things that happened amid all of the sadness and the sorrow. But I say I don't like talking about it because it's a troubling thing to consider as a Jesuit, that all of the heartache and all of the harm that was caused for the Jesuits and the people they served by these expulsions and by the suppression of the Society of Jesus. It's a lot of noise of the evil spirit, but we're going to see if we can kind of separate out a little bit the noise from the quieter ways that God was at work, and see what we can learn about discernment in the process. Bit of a historical introduction. I just wanted to briefly talk about the size of the Society of Jesus in 1749, so we can kind of get a scope. Why 1749? Because it's when I have some good statistics that another historian kindly put together. The Society of Jesus in 1749, so about 20 years from the full suppression of the society, and still about a decade from when the society started getting expelled from major European countries. There were 22,589 Jesuits, 11,000 of whom roughly were priests. I don't know how many were brothers, but we can quite easily assume that this is a society very much growing. There are only 11,293 priests. We're talking about a sizable number of scholastics. By way of comparison, in 2022, there were 14,439 Jesuits in the world, of whom 10,432 were priests and 850 were brothers. So what we see there is a more top-heavy society, which we're quite aware of today. Fewer men in formation, but there were a lot of men in formation. The society was very large, on the cusp of the suppression of the society. The society was very large. We were confessors at most of the major courts in Europe. We were running key educational institutions, not just in Europe, but also in the countries where we had missions. There was just the society was at a height of influence and exposure in society, in the greater society. And of course, that's part of how we got caught up in what happened. A lot of the movement around the suppression was a political movement that was against the old ways of politics, and our associations with monarchs and other things like that did not stand us in good stead. Does that mean that we were too involved in politics? Maybe, sometimes, but fundamentally what it means is that we were where things were happening, which is where we are called to be as Jesuits. We had, by the way, just as another statistic, we had over 600 colleges at the time of the suppression, or before the expulsions. Another bit of background to just kind of make the suppression make a little bit more sense. A key timeline here: 1758 is when Lorenzo Ricci is elected Superior General of the Society at the 19th General Congregation. That's going to be the last General Congregation until the restoration of the Society. The next General Congregation is going to happen in 1820, 6 years after the restoration of the Society. It's 1 year after Father Ricci is elected a Superior General that the Jesuits are expelled from Portugal. That's 1759. 1764, the Jesuits are expelled from France. 1767, they're expelled from Spain. 1767, they're also expelled from Naples. 1768, from the Duchy of Parma. And in 1773, with the papal brief Dominus Ac Redemptor Noster, Pope Clement XIV universally suppressed the Society. Which is quite a contrast from his predecessor in 1765, amid all the expulsions. There had already been the one from Portugal and France at this point. Pope Clement XIII issued an Apostolicum Pascendi, which was a full-throated papal defense of the Jesuits. So our fortunes changed universally with the popes, and I'll tell a little bit of that story. The key movements to remember that are really driving anti-Jesuit animosity at this time is an anti-papal nationalism that's growing in these countries. There's this real movement, an Enlightenment movement, that is starting to see the Pope as a foreign monarch that's trying to control things. And these national movements, because this is the birth of nationalism, as we know, by the end of the 18th century, there's going to be the United States is going to be founded, and by the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution is going to have happened. And all those things are still in the future, but there's this growing movement of kind of creating nations, Enlightenment education, and the Jesuits are tied to the papacy and running education. And if you're running education, then you're forming the way people think. And these movements, these Enlightenment movements that are trying to create nations and trying to create, sort of a new way of looking at life based on different philosophical principles. They don't like the fact that the Jesuits are this international order and are linked to ways of thinking that do not necessarily go along with these new Enlightenment mythologies that they're creating around the nation states. So nationalism, anti-papal, that's one movement. Another movement is the Jansenist movement, which is very much against the Jesuits' pastoral approach. It's a much harsher vision of Christianity, and so the Jesuits are accused of being morally lax, of being superstitious, and all these other things like that. And the third thing that's going on is the Jesuits, as I've already mentioned, are very powerful and very prestigious at this time. They're in a lot of places of authority and influence, and that makes them a target. So with all the kind of general Jesuit animosity towards all the things we do different, there's this specific thing where nationalism is getting very anti-papal, where Jansenism is getting very against the Jesuit pastoral approach, and where the Jesuits being in positions of influence makes them a target when people are angry about the Catholic Church in general. These are the movements that lead to the suppression of the Society of Jesus, not movements that are fundamentally about Jesuit sins or Jesuit pride, but movements in which the Jesuits are caught up because of who we are. Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, who later becomes the Marquis de Pombal, and we Jesuits tend to call him Pombal, or the Marquis de Pombal, although that's, as I said, it's a bit out of place because he wasn't actually the Marquis de Pombal when he was doing these things when he took the actions that led to the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portugal. But I start the story with him because he's kind of one of the first villains against the Jesuits that causing the first expulsion of the Jesuits from the Kingdom of Portugal. He's one of the three secretaries of state to the King of Portugal, starting at about 1750. What does Pombal want? Pombal wants to move Portugal towards an enlightened form of government based on, these new philosophical principles. He's not interested in religion. He's not interested in monarchy. He wants, this movement towards capitalism, movement towards more kind of Lockean principles of government, as in John Locke, all these sorts of things. And the Jesuits are seen as a hindrance on all of this for their support of the monarchy, for their religious views, for their control of education, largely controlling most of the main schools at this time in Portugal and in a lot of countries. Jesuits also attract some negative attention through our folly, although, as I've said, I don't think that that's the key reason for the suppression. But in 1756, Gabriel Malagrida, who's a Jesuit, delivers a sermon blaming this major devastating earthquake in Lisbon on Portugal's sins. In 1757, he also delivers a sermon that's very critical of the Marquis de Pombal's state-sponsored monopolies and the way that they're oppressing people. He becomes sort of a lightning rod that Pombal uses to say how evil the Jesuits were. He certainly seems to me, from the exterior, like he was going a little bit far. I hope you don't think that God sends earthquakes to punish people for bad politicians. This is not good theology, typical enough theology, but not good theology. But what he really provides is not the reason for the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portugal, but the excuse, because he's sort of a dramatic example that Pombal can point to. At the same time, what Pombal really wants is control of the education and control of the money. In fact, particularly, he really wants control of the Jesuit reductions. Because the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay and in that area of South America are very lucrative, but most of the profits are going to the native peoples and they're not going into the coffers of the state, and Pombal wants that money. So he wants money, he wants control of education, and the Jesuits are seen as a stumbling block. And he kind of gets, progressively, he gets the Jesuits kicked out of things. First, he gets them dismissed as confessors to the court in 1757. In 1758, he gets a cardinal to investigate the Jesuits, and this cardinal finds the Jesuits guilty of commerce and usurpation of Portuguese authority. Fun crime to be guilty of. In 1758, the real excuse comes on the scene, which is that there's an assassination in September 1758. There's an assassination attempt of the monarch, and Pombal says, the Jesuits were behind it, which of course we weren't. But nonetheless, it's an excuse. And eventually, as a result of all of this, because he wants the schools and he wants control and he wants the money, he gets the Jesuits expelled. And in 1758, we're expelled from Portugal. The stories are similar in other countries. In France, there's a precipitating incident. The precipitating incident is the French Jesuit mission in Martinique. There are English pirates who seize French ships with goods, coffee, sugar, tea, cocoa, that are coming from the Jesuit-run plantations in Martinique. And so all of these goods are lost, and it's a huge financial loss for the society that is compounded by the fact that the Jesuit superior of the mission had been speculating. He had been paying for things using the potential profits of these goods. And so this is the absolute financial ruin of this endeavor. There's all these loans that they can't pay back, and of course that's not a good thing. This Jesuit shouldn't have been doing those things. There's absolutely a fault here, but what it provides once more is an excuse, because in 1760, the court that is investigating this does not just hold the mission responsible for this monetary loss. It holds the province responsible and the Universal Society of Jesus. This becomes a way to attack all of the Jesuits, which is a clear indication that the motive is not just recouping the losses. The motive is attacking the Society of Jesus for a great many other things. It's a great excuse to get rid of the Jesuits in France. And in fact, when the case eventually comes before the Parliament of Paris, what does the Parliament of Paris say? A lot of things that don't have anything to do with finances or the mission in Martinique. It criticizes the Jesuits for their idolatrous Chinese rites, going all the way back to Ricci and saying, "Oh, the Jesuits, they're not true Christians." Criticizes the Jesuits for their despotic form of government and the rule by a foreign general. So nationalist motivations, classic anti-Jesuit things, saying the Jesuits are too monarchically structured, and the money kind of recedes as just one of the things that the Jesuits are criticized for. What we see, in other words, is all of these various forces, including Jansenism, which is very strong in France. That's where it's from. Which is against Jesuit pastoral practice. All this culminates in the Parliament of Paris deciding that the Society of Jesus is no longer legal in France. They didn't actually, this is in 1761, they didn't actually expel the Jesuits in France, but they did, in the sense that they didn't ship them out, which is what they did in Portugal and Spain. They actually shipped Jesuits out of the country, but they did say that they could no longer live in communities, they could no longer run their schools. And so the Jesuits are suppressed in France by 1764. I'm going to go through one more of the stories here about the suppression to make a little bit of a point, which is I want to talk a little bit about the expulsion in Spain. But instead of going through the excuses, because I think you're getting the story in terms of what are the reasons for the expulsions, they're the same in all of these places. Instead, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the experience of the Jesuits of the expulsion. In 1767, King Carlos III of Spain has, and his governors, his bureaucrats, his courtiers, are orchestrate the seizure of all the Jesuit communities all at the same time. This is a huge undertaking with soldiers, where every Jesuit community is surrounded by soldiers. The soldiers come in at 5 o'clock in the morning, round up all the Jesuits into the refectory, read them a decree of the king, and march them off until eventually they get all the Jesuits to the ports in Spain. And all the Jesuits are put on ships bound for the Papal States, forcibly expelled. Young, old, sick, healthy, doesn't matter. It's this mass deportation of Jesuits. What they're read when they're gathered together in their refectories is the following decree: I, Charles, King, impelled by most grave reasons, and by the obligation which our Majesty is under to maintain peace and order and justice within our domains, and for other weighty reasons which by their nature must remain unrevealed in our royal bosom, do by this royal edict ordain and command that all members of the Society of Jesus, all and several, shall on the reading of this our edict leave and be expelled from all our domains, meaning not just Spain but also the Spanish territories in the New World. To wit, from our domains in Spain, Americas, the Indies, and the islands of the Philippines, and from all other lands which are subject to our Majesty. And we furthermore decree that all the possessions of the said society and all the said territories of ours shall be and are by this act declared confiscated to the crown of Spain. Didn't catch that last part. He just said that he's taking all the society's goods. So there's also wealth involved in all of this. In this expulsion enters a person, a character in the story that is going to be very important during the time of the suppression, which is for a different lecture, but I want to introduce him here because he's important at this moment as well, and that is Jose Pignatelli. Jose Pignatelli is born in 1738 in Saragossa in Spain. He enters the Society of Jesus in 1753. And in 1762, he starts his first assignment teaching at the Jesuit College in Saragossa. Also does a lot of pastoral ministries. He's known as the father of the gallows. He comforts and gives the sacraments to people who are about to be executed. He's a member of the 4 market preachers who go out on Sundays and feast days to preach in the squares. Unremarkable, holy, yes, good, pastoral, but he's not a big, flashy Jesuit. He's a young priest. He's not a superior. He hasn't even taken final vows. He's in his first assignment. And there is one thing that's remarkable about him. He's from a very wealthy and influential noble family in Spain. So when the soldiers come to his community in Saragossa, they pull him aside and they tell him, your family will take care of you. You don't need to be expelled. You can just leave. And Pignatelli says, absolutely not. I'm staying with my brother Jesuits. If they're expelled, I'm expelled. But the deferential and the preferential treatment that he's getting from the soldiers leads first his superior and then his provincial and then all the provincials in Spain eventually to decide if there's anybody who can negotiate with these soldiers and with the government to make sure that all the Jesuits get what they need during this deportation activity where conditions are not great. And as I said, young and old, healthy and infirm, Jesuits are being piled onto ships under terrible conditions. They decide if anybody can deal with it, if anybody can coordinate to make sure the Jesuits get what they need, it's Pignatelli who apparently people are listening to, and he has connections. And so de facto, Pignatelli, this young priest, without final vows, gets delegated authority. He becomes effectively the provincial of all of the Spanish Jesuits as they are pushed onto ships, and 5,000 Jesuits are exiled from Spain. That's all the story of Pignatelli I'm going to tell today. Stay tuned for what he did during the time of the suppression, but that's an important bit of the story. So now let's talk about the universal suppression. As I noted at the beginning of the lecture, on the 7th of January, 1765, Pope Clement XIII wrote a brief supporting the society amid all of these expulsions, amid all of these accusations against the society, where he noted that the Society of Jesus has given to the world an example of a sublime devotion and holiness. Therefore, unsparingly, we give the Society of Jesus not only our own fullest approbation, but moreover, we renew and confirm by our apostolic authority all the declarations of approval bestowed on it by our own venerable predecessors. So the Society of Jesus, despite being in the bad graces of important monarchs, still has papal support until 1769 when Pope Clement XIII dies. The conclave that is called to elect his successor is a highly political affair, as many conclaves are. And the key camps that we need to pay attention to are the camp that all they want is a candidate for Pope who will suppress the society, and the not as influential camp that want a pope who is not going to suppress the society. The problem is that neither one of them can act completely independently, and so there is need for a compromise candidate because the anti-Jesuit people are not letting a Jesuit-friendly pope be elected, and the Jesuit-friendly people are not letting an anti-Jesuit pope be elected, and there's all this politicking going on. And they settle on a candidate, Giovanni Gagnelli, who is a conventual Franciscan. He's going to be Clement XIV. And there's basically two things that he does that make him acceptable to the anti-Jesuits, but not the worst candidate for the pro-Jesuit folks. He says that although he was a friend of the Jesuits, educated by the Jesuits, he was friendly with Jesuits prior to being elected Pope, but he gave people to believe at the conclave, whatever the truth of it is, that he was critical a lot of things about the Jesuits. So he indicated some criticism of the Jesuits. But the key second thing that he indicated was not that he would suppress the Society of Jesus, but that he thought he could. There was debate among canon lawyers at this time about whether the Pope could suppress the society, which strikes me every time I say it is very, very strange, because I don't see why the Pope couldn't. But there was debate about this, as sometimes happens in canonical circles. And I'd have to ask somebody more versed in canon law about why there was debate about this. But he said, no, certainly he thought that he could, as Pope, suppress the Society of Jesus. And that's enough to get him elected as the compromise candidate. He didn't say he wanted to suppress the society. He said he was open to it. There is an enormous pressure campaign from the monarchs who have already expelled the society to get him to suppress the society as soon as he becomes Pope. It's really why he gets elected. And I don't know if it's to his credit or not, but what he does is delay and delay and delay and try to put it off, and eventually gives in to the pressure from the monarchs. I would say that my read on Clement XIII's reason for suppressing the society is he feels that the political pressures against him are so great that perhaps, because really a lot of these pressures, as I've already indicated, are anti-Catholic and anti-papal. And so I think that Clement XIV thinks that if he suppresses the society, he can save the church. I think he thinks if he sacrifices the society, he can save the church. And that's the deal that he makes. He's wrong. The things that he thought he could stop from happening don't happen anyway. Namely, the French Revolution happens, and there is tremendous loss of life among the clergy and anti-Catholicism and all sorts of things. He doesn't stop the anti-Catholic movements and the Republican and Democratic movements that are anti-religious in general, meaning anti-religion, not just religious like Jesuits, but them too. He doesn't stop any of these things by his suppression of the Jesuits. So he was certainly wrong in that, we can say from the vantage point of the future. Some people would say he was weak. Some people would say he was crafty, because of the fact that the way he suppressed the society, as is a topic for another lecture, allowed for the restoration of the society much more easily than other ways he might have suppressed it. So a lot of opinions about him. What I want to emphasize is, once more, the noise. This kind of thought that the Jesuits getting rid of the Jesuits is the solution because they're causing all of this uproar in the church. Well, getting rid of the Jesuits didn't solve the problems of the church. The noise was not where God was speaking. The suppression of the Jesuits did not bring peace and tranquility to Europe or to the church. And that's an important lesson, that sometimes, again, the noisiness is not where God's Spirit is speaking. The actual suppression, I want to talk a little bit about Lorenzo Ricci. In February of 1773, Ricci writes a letter to all the provincials of the society in which he says, "I see with confusion that the Lord has still not deigned to extend his hand to raise us up. Certainly he has given us many reasons for his mercy towards us, and we experience in 1,000 ways his presence and almost miraculous patronage. With all that he has also given free course to our calamities. I adore his always just judgments. The cause of the calamities we must contribute to our own faults, and especially mine. But still, why? Perhaps our Lord, whose nature is goodness, will forget to use his mercy. By chance, will God forget his pity?" He's quoting scripture there. "We know that his acts of mercy are more abundant than those of his justice and those of other attributes. And so I pray to him, and you should pray together with me, that he take account of our fragility and debility, so that he inclines to mercy and commiseration." There's a real pain that we read in Ricci's words here. Ricci was a very spiritual leader at the time of the suppression. He was a very quiet general. They might have elected someone who was willing to fight for the society. At the 19th General Congregation, they might have elected someone who was willing to be more of a politician. But who they elected, the one that they elected was one who was prayerful and counseled humility and prayer and cared deeply for the society. Was that the right choice? I'm not really interested in going back and rewriting history or talking about what might have happened if we had elected someone else. But what we got was someone who was very admirable for his love for the society, but who submitted very humbly to what happened. And perhaps our humble submission to the suppression is the real mark of the Jesuits staying true to who they were and who we are. Because, of course, we are the servants of the church, and whether the Pope was right or wrong to suppress us, he had the right to suppress us. And that's the story. Ricci in August of 1773, and all of the Jesuits at the Roman Curia, which at this time is at the Jesuit, are gathered together in a room that's now called the Sala Rupe. It still exists. I've been in it many times. It's a library now. At the Jesuit, and they're gathered in this room and they read the brief of suppression. And the official Jesuit historian who writes an account of the suppression says the following words about what happened after the brief was read to the general, with the papal troops there who were going to immediately arrest him and take him away. This Jesuit Cordata says, Ricci was dumbstruck when the brief was produced, shown, and read. He had no suspicion of it. Asked by order of the pontiff whether he accepted the decision, he answered that what the supreme pontiff decided was sacred and ought to be obeyed by all. There was no need of his approval. There was no need of his approval. Ricci's attitude, they ask him, do you accept the suppression of the society? And Ricci's like, I don't have to accept it. The Pope gets to decide this, and I have to submit to it. And he's taken off into prison. They're convinced the Jesuits are hiding money, which we're not, despite what you might have heard. And they're convinced, they're worried about whether the Jesuits are going to be obedient, which also is not a problem. And he's taken off to Castel Sant'Angelo, and it's there that he dies. Imprisoned and constantly questioned about where the secret treasury of the Jesuits are. The story of his death is awful. He dies without benefit of the sacraments. They don't allow him to make confession or receive Eucharist or the anointing of the sick before he dies, which is a pretty awful thing for them to have done to him. And the story I've heard, although I've never confirmed it, but I heard it from a credible source, I've never confirmed it in documents, but is that the Master General of the Dominicans goes to the Pope and demands the body after Ricci has died, so that he can give Ricci a proper burial, which is, I'm told, the origin of why to this day, if a Dominican Master General dies in office or a Jesuit Father General dies in office, the Dominican Master General presides at the funeral of the Jesuit Father General, and the Jesuit Father General presides at the funeral of a Dominican Master General. A nice act of charity on the part of the Dominicans at an awful time for the Society of Jesus. Ricci, who had been very quiet and prayerful, wrote a document that is called his Last Testament when he was very near to the end. I just want to read a couple excerpts on it to close this lecture on the suppression of the society. Because I know not the moment when it shall please God to call me to himself on account of the length of my years and the trials which have undermined my strength, I am certain, I feel I have a duty to perform without delay, a duty which I owe the order, which confided to me the responsibility of being its superior general. Conscious, therefore, of the fact that I am soon to appear before the infallible tribunal of truth and justice, at which alone truth and justice are certain to be found, I have deliberated long and attentively. I have prayed humbly to my most merciful Redeemer and most august Judge not to permit me to be moved by passion or the spirit of vindictiveness or any other unworthy motive. First, I solemnly declare and protest that the Society of Jesus was wholly guiltless of any act or provocation that justified its suppression. Certain knowledge I had at my command as its superior general enables me to bear incontestable witness to the innocence of the society in this respect. Secondly, I declare and protest that my own incarceration is also entirely without justification. My only reason for making this vindication in my own behalf is the obligation I am under to safeguard the good name of the Society of Jesus, which saw fit to elect me as its superior general. Strong words from a humble man, and I think they're important words to consider. And when you read the briefs of suppression, some historians have argued that the brief of suppression gives no real reason for the suppression of the Society of Jesus other than to restore peace and tranquility to the church. And I would argue that that's a false statement. I would argue that if you read the brief carefully, what you see emerging in the brief is accusation after accusation of everything that it makes the Society of Jesus unique, that gives it its particular charism and mission in the church, is what we were suppressed for. We were suppressed for the things that make us who we are, the things that make us distinct and that characterize our service to the church. And so that therefore, we were not suppressed for our sins. We were suppressed, in fact, for the ways that of who we are and the ways that we serve in the church. And that's what Ricci's saying in this last testament. And it's an important thing that what Ricci saw at the end of his life was that he needed to stay true to who he was as a Jesuit so that he would not get taken away by the noise, but to stay true to the quiet way that God was acting in his life. And I think it's an important lesson for us all about discernment in troubled times. Thank you.